Let's talk about metagame tier updates. I know people really like this video. So we'll get into it and we'll start talking about what is the most powerful things that you could be doing in Recross and whatnot. Basically, I think literally anything that is above C tiered can be ran pretty easily and win some games. There's so many C tier stuff now that I might, in my future videos, be only doing B tier and above. But right now, I think literally anything that's C tier and above will always be pretty good and a very, very good chance for you to win in Wixoss at any tournaments, probably your locals. If you were at your ceremonies, I might consider B tier and above as being the stuff that I would prefer to go after. But this is where I currently think things stand going into the next set. So I will have to readjust this. Take this with a grain of salt. This is just my opinion. Moving forward, I think this is something that you'll want to look into for your decks. I will readjust after 2 or 3 weeks of watching the meta evolve a bit. And normally my tier lists have been pretty accurate at the front end, and then the little bits of shifting that happens after that 3-week mark usually turns it into like, okay, now we know exactly what we're looking at. So I've also done something new with the tier list to help sort of make boxes that I'm looking to check off now that we've got literally so many decks that you can run and be somewhat successful with, that I have given basically three divisions or scores to each deck based on how I think it does in each of these categories. And the three are powerful, consistent, and layered. Now, layered's the most difficult one to describe. Powerful is pretty simple. Is it good? Like, is it strong? Does it feel like you're doing things at the whole time that feel like are actively helping you win a game? That's what powerful is. So, for example, I think X is the most powerful deck in the meta. X, with its access to assassin, easily brings back ways easy ways to do more than 4 damage a turn with its piece, as well as double crush, and has ways to open up lanes as needed, and also enter burn the opponent down to basically make them defenseless against you. This is all very, very powerful things that you could be doing. Whether or not it's the most consistent or the most layered deck out of everything, I don't know. I don't think it is one of those things, but I think it's easily the most powerful deck. Consistency, however, is also a very important topic. And consistency, I think the most consistent deck in the format is Deus, especially the Atomic Deus deck. Deus as an Elrig just gives the ability to get anything you need from your trash back to your hand. It runs Elrigs that also help smooth out the consistency. It runs cards that help you find the cards that you need, so that helps with consistency. And it's just so redundant in the fact that almost all of the cards do one of the two things: open up lanes or make your opponents discard cards. That it's just incredibly consistent deck. It's easy to draw the correct cards when you're almost always guaranteed to hit them. So I think Deus is the most consistent deck in the meta. And then layered is the most complicated one. So layered means that it's doing something, it has the ability to be a little bit more versatile than not, right? So X is the most powerful deck in the meta. It's also an aggro deck, and generally speaking, aggro, right, it deals damage to the opponent. But why is it that X is better than something like Hirana or Lion or this Cosmos deck that also consistently do damage? And the answer is because they aren't layered. Layering means that you are able to change gears and deal with a lot of threats. So not only are you versatile in what you can do, but it also means that you're versatile in terms of your matchups. X has generally more favorable matchups than the Cosmos deck does. And because of that, it's more of a versatile deck. It's also layered in the fact that the Enter Burn, or the ability that it has even a small sub-theme of being able to bring back cards from the trash to their hand, allows it to be more versatile. in general than what these other decks are doing. And all of its versatility does not come at any cost to its consistency or its power, which is layered sometimes will cost, like you can be a very layered deck, but it comes at the cost of your consistency. You're playing a bunch of one-ups, for example. That might screw with your consistency. X doesn't have that problem. It is very layered in the fact that it can do all those things. Atomic Deus is also pretty layered in the fact that it has a very multifaceted defense option in H2O, while also being discard-centric. So it is a mid-range deck. It does open up lanes. That's its main functionality. But the discard supports it attritioning out its opponent, and that can be considered layered in that type of deck. Because the discard is not its main function. Its main function is actually to open up lanes. So that is where these 3 check marks that I'm looking for come at. The thing that I'm doing now is I'm tiering them based on how well they hit those check marks. So for example, if they're extremely powerful, extremely consistent, extremely layered, they have all 3 marks and all their marks are high marks, right? They have high scores on all of them. They end up in the S tier deck list. If they hit the, which I'm looking for is just power across, like it's consistently high across the board, for power, consistency, and layered, then it hits the A tier deck. This thing that separates the A tier deck and the S tier deck is not much, mind you. It's only a little bit. So I don't want you to look at S tier and think X or Deus is so much stronger than the Tamago deck is. I don't think it is. I think they're only slightly stronger in a vacuum, in an overall meta. Right, I think Tamago, for what it's worth, Tamago, the mid-range deck, actually beats Deus, the Atomic Deus deck. Not by a huge margin, but by enough that I think it beats literally in a 1-versus-1 matchup. I just think it's also maybe a little worse against X, and probably worse against this mono-white deck that's coming up. The mono-white decks have gotten a lot better because of cards that are introduced in this set, and I think Tamago is going to struggle with it a little bit. So that's why I haven't put Tamago into the S tier list. It's still A, though. I think A is consistently powerful, consistently consistent, which is just the weird thing to say, and consistently layered. B is where these things slightly lose it. So B tier is where you have 2 of these things that are A-tiered power, right? So they might have A-tier power and A-tier layered, but they're slightly less consistent or something like that, right? So it still means that the deck itself is almost A-tier, but it's a little less consistent in how it plays those things. So it's sometimes you might have a good game, sometimes you might draw all of pile B and not pile A, and it will screw you. So that's where B comes into. Overall, still incredibly strong choices, only slightly lower than A tier. The gap really starts happening when you hit C tier. C tier is when you only have 2 of these checkboxes, right? It's powerful and consistent, but not layered. It's powerful and layered, but not consistent. It's layered and consistent, but it lacks power. Things like that, right? And then D tier is it really only checks 1 of those boxes off. It really does really, really well in power, or it's really, really, really consistent, but it really doesn't do much more than that. The D tier is what I've shaved the most decks out of, because I just think we're at this point now where C tier has so much going for it, so much in there, that we really don't need a stacked D tier, and you really should be looking at C tier and above. So I've just taken out a lot of stuff from there. I don't think they're even worth putting on your radar anymore. That's the reason why some things still exist on D tier, mind you, is because I think they'll show up in your locals, even if they're not super, super, super strong. And I just don't think that we have a wide variety of those decks anymore. And just generally speaking, people are going to pick C tier and above. So I've trimmed down D tier. Let's get into the specific decks themselves. So we talked about S tier, and we have X and Deus there. Again, I think these things are just slightly stronger than the other options. With our A tier, I think these are very strong options as well. We've got Deus on there, and this is just Deus aggro. I think Deus aggro got a buff in terms of the fact that it now has Tama to help with its consistency, its enter consistency issues, and it got another Signy, the Rise level 2 Signy, that allow you to not be clapped, or sorry, disrespected. And between the clap and the disrespect, I think it's stronger. I don't think we're at a S tier yet for Deus. I think maybe I can't remember when the Terra Beast combo comes in. I think you might consider it at S tier at that point, but we're not quite there yet. I put Tamago 2 down the mid-range blue-black, the one that does well in the ceremony, the discard deck. I put this down as a tier deck. Again, I think it struggles with mono white. In my testing, that's what I found, was that actually it did struggle with mono white in the set prior to this, and mono white only becomes stronger. It's got Tama, and I think Tama is a very good mono white leader. I also think that the literally 3 or 4 cards that it gained from this set puts it in, just catapults its tier. So I think it's super strong there. And that's why I put down Tama as that's the next option. You'll see all the blue here, by the way. This is just new decks that I think are entering into the meta and might be here for a little bit. Some of these decks may come in, they may be tested for a while, which means they're meta for a little bit and then start to fall off because they're not so great. I think Tama mono white will end up being here, whether or not, I think mono white in general will end up being here. Whether or not that be Akino being the mono white leader, Tama being the mono white leader, I don't quite know yet. I think there's options for both of them. I'm putting Tama there because I think that's the one that everyone's excited to play. So I think you'll end up seeing it more often. But I actually like Tama in white X mid-range. Now, what's that X? I don't know. I think green maybe is the X, right? I think you might have green and then maybe blue, maybe red, maybe yeah, I know, black. Literally, I just named every color as the third color that might be in it. I think next set it will 100% be green, because it will allow you to use Kayasumi a bit more into the deck. And I like Tama here more. Personally, I think Tama is better played as a mid-range deck than it is as a mono white leader. I think the strength of mono white is the main deck. I think the Elrig deck, White Heaven. I think the strength of Tama is best displayed in a mid-range deck where it can use Enter Depriving as its main focus. Moving right along, we've got Tamago 2 as well for a atomic build. I think this is pretty good. I like it here. I think it maybe functions the best as the best blue atomic deck, if you wanted to be a blue atomic deck instead of a black atomic deck. And I just think it's okay there. I think it's worse than the just the straight up mid-range version of Tamago. Moving into our tier B, I have Akino here. Like I said, this is White Heaven aggro mono white. You could potentially bump this into the bottom of A tier if you wanted to. I just think until we decide whether Akino or Tama is the best mono white thing, you could swap them depending on when we figure that out. Madoka 2.0, here's the thing. I've got Umir down later in the line. And I think Umir and Madoka compete for which is the best. I think you'll see Madoka more often than you'll see Umir, but due to Tiffany's recent string of successes with Umir, you can see the deck kind of chilling in the background because I just did the deck tech for this one. I think it might be okay to push this up to above Madoka, but I refuse to do that until the meta evolves a little bit and I do the final meta standings for this set. I think Madoka still is very, very strong here. Now, you could go with Atomic or you could go with Tempo, and that might be one of the reasons why I put Madoka 2 higher up than Umir, is the fact that there's 2 different builds that you could be running with it, whereas Umir, there's really only one build that you could be running with it. I think they're slightly different in the fact that the Tempo builds, Madoka 2.0 has a bit more of a better early game aggression and then a better late game discard option, whereas Umir has a better late game probably aggression, while also having a better early game card disruption, sort of flip-flop on which one does which. And then Umir also does a better job at stopping Enter from happening. Anyways, I think they're both pretty overlappy. I think you could choose one or the other. Hirana, I've got as a B-tiered no limit aggro deck. I like it. I think it's still fine here. I don't see anyone really punishing teams yet, so I think it's still very valid to use this. As to whether is it a better red aggro deck than X is, I think the answer is if you see a literal metric ton of discard in your meta and you're constantly fighting against that, but you still want to play red aggro, I think Hirana is probably the better choice there in that scenario. X did just get a card that helps battle against discard decks, though, so maybe not. But I still think it's a very, very strong to use. I talked about the Umir decks. The Lion decks kind of falls in the same area as Hirana does. The Lion decks have sort of been taken over by these mono white decks, but I still think they're that Card Jockey is still a very strong choice to use here. I don't see anyone really punishing the teams yet with the Machina Guardian Dragon, but if you were to see more of those punishes, then yeah, that's something that you might want to consider taking less of. It actually does get powered up by Remember here, so while I was tempted to throw this into bottom of B tier, I just couldn't bring myself to do it because it did get a little bit of power with Remember. Then I've got the Hirana mid-range deck. It feels like the mighty have fallen a little bit here with the Hirana mid-range deck, because this was top of A tier and now it's bottom of B tier. I don't think it's as good. I think Tama does a lot to the Tama white X midrange deck does a lot to push Hirana down. Hirana's real edge over its other mid-rangey control-y counterpart that it competed against, which was the Tamago 2 deck, was the fact that Hirana offers a clock. Tamago does not offer a clock innately. You need the black in order to make the clock function. And there are ways then to sort of like mess with that. So its late game win conditions can be a little harder to work with. Hirana didn't offer that. Hirana basically was just like, no, I will put you at a clock at all points in times, and I will also put down a pretty good defensive positioning. I think Tama offers a clock, and because of that, it's just slightly better. It costs 2 enter to deal an extra damage, and also, costs some attacks to deal an extra damage than Hirana's Reach does, but it can be reused multiple times. So I like that in the Tama deck. So I have Tama basically pushing Hirana down the ranks a little bit. I've also got Musica 2.0 here with the black-red with Assassin. I've tested this out actually quite a bunch. Later in my I stopped playing Atomic Deus just because I was bored with the deck, more or less. And I tested it Bang out a lot, and I tested Musica 2.0 out a lot. And what I found was the deck that we built was actually quite strong, just very underutilized in the meta. It's actually very powerful. It's pretty consistent. Not super consistent, but enough consistent. And it is layered in the fact that you can give Assassin to a lot of things. You can draw a lot of cards, and you can force your opponents out with a lot of bad catch-22s. So I like the Musica 2 deck. That is the black-red aggro one. There was a deck that people were running in Ceremony that was black-blue and doubled down on Ray in order to draw a bunch of cards and make the opponent discard a bunch of cards. I think if you were playing against a deck that was like, you were just playing a meta of nothing but Tamagos and Atomic Deus, that's probably something you definitely could consider to do instead and win the games with that. 100% would be okay with that scenario. But I think the black-red aggro version, because it has a clock innately built in, is better. Then I've got Pure Luke is the new blue-black discard deck that you're going to be seeing. I think it's worse than the Atomic deck, but also worse than the Tamago deck. And because of that, it just sort of pushes it down to the bottom of B tier. It does the discard job well, I think. It does the draw cards well. I actually think it pairs pretty well into counter discard decks. So I think you know, I'd rather personally be the discard deck than the discard deck that counters discard decks, because it puts you in as a little bit more of a niche scenario. But if that's where you want to be into, you probably could do it. I think because of that, it's a little less powerful. And I think I put it at the bottom of D tier deck. I don't think it'll hold at the bottom of D tier. I think it'll probably slip into C tier by next set. But I think enough people want to test Pure Luke that you're going to see a wave of Pure Lukes for a little while. Moving on to C tier, this is the checks 2 boxes, but not all of them. I have Deus midrange here, the white-black version. This is the one with White Heaven, basically. This deck hasn't really seen play at all, but is still a pretty powerful and consistent option that you can be using. I don't think it's fantastically layered, which is, I think, one of its issues. So I think it's still probably the best deck in C tier. After testing Bang, which is the card deck below it, I might give Bang the nudge up to the top of C tier. I think Bang 2.0 might be able to slip into B tier at the end of this, or during the middle of this set cycle. Bang 2.0 actually has a lot of things in it that are very strong. It's powerful, it's consistent, but it's not necessarily layered. I think it might be more layered with the recent changes or it was less consistent. I think it might be more consistent with the recent changes that I've made to it, which will nudge it into being powerful, layered, and less consistent. The layer, by the way, there is mill. Like, it has a very good mill option. It has a very good recur from the trash abilities. And the Lancer, being its powerful option, also kind of gives it layered because it beats Exia, it beats H2O, and it can beat Remember. So I think it might get the nudge into the bottom of B tier, which would be the first time a green deck has broken into B tier in a long time. But right now, until I get way further testing on this new set, I'm not going to put it higher than where it is right now. I have right below it another C-tiered green deck. Doesn't get so much major increases that I think it could be the top of C tier like it was at one point. It needs more good green cards, and those cards don't really exist. So, and the good cards that are coming out of Bang that push it up a tier are not green. So I don't think it's fantastic, but I still think it's a very, very, very solid green deck to choose. The funny thing is, you know, right after the ceremony, we went to our locals, and the 6th place winner, Anthony, took his Nova deck in, and another person brought in a white deck because, again, ceremony had some white in it, so people were excited to try it. And me and Tiffany both brought in Bang and Ott, and green pairs really well into white decks, very strongly into white decks. And it's just sort of a little bit of an eye-opening experience there. But because the top decks are red and blue, although I could argue black, being that black assist is like all over that S and A tier, it's not really shining as much as it could be shining right now. I've got Yuzuki as a red aggro deck in C tier. I think it puts on a clock. I think it enter burns, so I think it has a lot of things going for it, but I just don't know if it does it as well as X does, and even No Limit aggro does, so both of those sort of push it down to C tier. Ray 2.0 is a U white discard deck. What's pushing it down for me is that Madoka and Umir both are very, very good white-blue tempo decks. And this is a white-blue tempo deck, so this is your third white-blue tempo option. You could build Ray to be more of a blue-black tempo option, but then you're also running into the same problem, where you've got Deus to deal with, you've got Tamago to deal with, you got Pyraluke to deal with. I just don't think either one is quite powerful enough to push past C tier. But that's not to say that it doesn't have some powerful options, right? Like, double Firefly Squid is nasty, and also White Heaven is nasty, and so is giving any blue card on your field Assassin nasty. So I think it's really good. So I've got Nova here as a C tier deck. Anthony's gonna listen to this video and then yell at me later about this. The only reason I have it down so low is because I actually think it's just a really difficult deck to pilot. Um, I think it's actually B tier in terms of its power, its layeredness, and its consistency. And maybe it should be bottom of B tier. But the issue I have with it is I don't think the average person can pick up a Nova 2.0 deck. Shout out to the podcast where we talked about it over, and Anthony did a really great job explaining why you want to be playing certain things that you want to be playing. I By the way, I have it as Uchu team control there. Yeah. It doesn't necessarily need to be team, but I think it's best in team the way Anthony played it. I think it's just difficult to pilot, and because of that, you're not going to see a ton of it, which means it'll probably end up in C tier. I think if it was more widely played, it would probably end up in B tier, is my point. Musica, this is the Diagram Atomic midrange deck. This is kind of the one that I chose not to put on here, because I think it's probably closer to D tier than C tier once things start falling into place. I think there is a world where you could be playing Diagram with Atomic now that there's that new multicolored Atomic color out that's blue and green. But yeah, moving forward. I've got the Cosmos deck down as a C tier deck. This is because it is powerful and consistent, but is not layered in the slightest. It is a very good aggro deck, and if this deck existed in set 1, it probably would be S tier with how strong it is. But it's just the game has evolved to a point where you want more than what is offered here, and because there's no discard, no mill, no ways to mess with people's enters, right? There's just nothing going for it other than the fact that everything is a Lancelot. Now, everything is a Lancelot is great, but it doesn't make it layered. So it will lose to any of the decks that are good against aggro, and that's it. But it's very powerful and very consistent, so it still can win it definitely can still win a tournament pretty easily on its own. The D tier here, again, this is the stuff that's really only one. They're either very powerful, they're very consistent, or they're very layered, but nothing in between. I think Senga runs into that. I like Senga. I think it's actually quite consistent of a deck, but I don't know if it's very layered or it's very powerful. The Tamago freeze decks, I might be being unfair to Tamago here. Tamago might be, if it's non-team, a C tier deck. I did recently, not me, but I recently watched a game that Tiffany played against someone who was playing the Tamago freeze deck. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your name right off the top of my head, but Tiffany would have had it written down somewhere. And that deck was strong and consistent, so I think that might push it into C tier. But if you're doing the Uchu freeze team Uchu team, you still can get away with it. I just don't think it's super great. The last one here is Karjaki combo. I actually think it's very powerful with Wolf. Wolf does this is like the only deck that's like, hello, I'm gonna threaten 6 damage in 1 turn, so if you've taken 2 damage, you're dead. It's the only deck that can just do that out of nowhere. So I think it ends up being very powerful. So worth mentioning before we drop off and don't talk about any other cards in this or any other decks in this set. But I think these are the best decks that you could be playing right now. Later down the line, when we do more of an introduction to this set, probably in about 2 or 3 weeks with me and Tiffany on the podcast, we'll update this to be a better tier list. If you want to comment down below what you think your tier list is, and give me ideas as to why you think certain things are more powerful, or maybe even just what you think should be bumped up in this and what should be bumped down in this. I would love to hear what your all opinions are.